something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
Salutations, New Haven. Salutations, Connecticut. Salutations, everyone. We got a great show for you today. We're going to be talking about social work as activism with a great professor. But in the meantime, we want to remember that today is Juneteenth. And on Monday, there was a special coalition. There's a Juneteenth coalition of Greater New Haven. And they had the governor there, the mayor there, all kinds of dignitaries there. And they raised the flag to celebrate Juneteenth. And there are numerous events going on around New Haven, on the green and throughout, and at restaurants and all kinds of things. There's a lot of singing and dancing. And this is a special occasion. And more than any other time. This Juneteenth began when when in Texas, in Galveston, slaves were already freed by the federal government. But Texans did not tell them. And so they kept them in slavery. And when they found out, this is why Juneteenth is the celebration. And it reminds me a little bit about today, because there's an eradication of black culture in our country, in black history. And I think today, if this is the weekend, please go down to New Haven. There are numerous Juneteenth celebration events in the state of Connecticut. Go to one, enjoy the day, learn a little bit more about history. And hey, power salute to the Juneteenth Coalition of Greater New Haven today. All right, thank you. And Professor, can you introduce yourself and tell us who you are and about your work and your passion?
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Stephen Monroe Tomczak, and I am professor of social welfare policy and community organization at the Southern Connecticut State University School of Social Work, where for the past 20 years I have taught social welfare policy and the development of the social work profession from an historical perspective. So I study the history of social welfare, of social movements, and social change, and focus on how we can, by building power, build a better society, a society that exemplifies the kinds of values that are, I think, honored today on Juneteenth, but also are very much a part of the social work profession at its best. Social work certainly has at times functioned as a mechanism of social control, but it has also functioned as a mechanism of liberation. And I certainly align myself self-consciously with the liberatory and radical aspects of the field, radical, of course, being properly understood at getting at the roots of social problems, while at the same time, of course, trying to limit the damage that this system of economic domination, exploitation, and oppression under which we live creates. And so I come to this work, and perhaps I can give you a little bit of background about myself. At Southern, I'm not just a faculty member. I'm also an alum. I graduated from Southern Connecticut State University. It's hard to believe when I think about it. I think 37 years ago. How time flies. And when I was a student at Southern, I was engaged in some activism. I would not call myself a leader, but I was part of a group called Students for Peace. some of whom I am still working with or reconnected with and am now working with in the New Haven area. I particularly would like to salute Paula and Frank Panzarella, who you may know, longtime New Haven activists, and who were part of that group, and were certainly among the leaders of that group. But I was, you know, an activist of sorts at the time. Participated, of course, in some of the resistance against South African apartheid, the divestment movement in the 1980s, and you know, developed an interest in political and social change. And I didn't go, even though both my parents were clinical social workers, I didn't see social work necessarily as a career, because I thought of it as what my parents did, which was to provide therapeutic interventions for various populations. And that was not the kind of career path that I wanted. Well, whatever, after being at Southern as a student, I decided to investigate graduate school, and I was considering various fields, including library science, but decided I would check out my parents' alma mater, the UConn School of Social Work. And I discovered there that they had this whole area of social work, of which I was frankly unaware, we call macro practice. Social welfare policy, community organization, agency leadership and administration. And the community organization and social policy aspects of it were what particularly interested me. And so I ended up studying that at the UConn School of Social Work, graduating with a Master's of Social Work, and then went on for doctoral education at Brandeis University, where I studied with a critical thinker named Dr. David G. Gill, who is someone I would suggest people should be more familiar with, certainly in our field of social work. And I see myself as carrying on his legacy of teaching critical consciousness, a critical analysis of these systems under which we live, so that we can understand them and thereby take action to change them. So, you know, that's a long introduction, of course. And as far as my passion is concerned, what is my passion? It's this. It's fighting the forces of oppression to create a socially and, extremely importantly, economically just society. Because without economic justice, one cannot have true social and political justice. As the famous quote from Martin Luther King suggests, what good does it do someone to sit at a formerly segregated lunch counter when they cannot afford to buy a hamburger? That's what it's all about. We have to have economic justice in order to have social and political justice. All right. I'm sure you have many more questions.
No, we've got it. It reminds me that in Irish history, we have True Valiant. True Valiant was Victoria's policymaker for social welfare. And so during the Irish famine, it appears that we exported more food from Ireland than we did before the famine. And True Valiant had a policy focus that if you were poor, it was your fault. The best thing you can do for poor parents is to take their children away from them. So his poorhouses, and it was a very brutal policy. And I do worry from time to time that, you know, if we don't understand this policy fight, that policy in terms of, when I look at it in terms of equity and stuff, there are people who look at policy as ways to paint victims as at fault. And so if I'm poor, I'm hungry, I'm homeless, it's my fault. I didn't work hard enough. And so that was a extremely popular policy focus of the Victorian era in England. And Ireland suffered for that over there. So I'm wondering, is it similar in the U.S.? Do we have policy focuses that are truly helpful, or policy focus that blame people?
Well, you know, it's interesting. You should allude to the English poor law there, because of course the U.S. system is heavily based in that kind of model, and it's interesting to note that the United States, in many respects, has stuck to the kind of harsh, blaming the victim kind of approach to providing assistance to people for much longer and in much more virulent ways than is the case in England and certainly on the European continent. Where while it is hardly perfect and there have been retrenchments over the last 40 years as there have been here in the United States, certainly there are a wider array of universal programs available in those societies that assure some measure of economic security. Of course, national health insurance, the true national health insurance that guarantees people health care, provision being a bedrock of that. But in any event, I think you're absolutely onto something, that this fundamental distinction coming out of the English poor law tradition of making a distinction between so-called deserving and so-called undeserving recipients of aid is one of the hallmark principles that underlies our social welfare system in the United States, drawn from the poor law tradition, and produces much of the dysfunction that we see in our social welfare system. Most of the programs that we have, that you could name, Medicaid, SNAP, the programs that are under the most vicious attack by the current regime, are what we call in social welfare policy means-tested programs. That means that the income and assets of the recipient are examined to see that they fall below a certain level, and therefore someone is seen as deserving of aid. There are also various categorical requirements that imply a certain kind of moral judgment about the connection between the aid-giving system and the employment system. Thereby, the people that qualify for these programs are considered to be, or are perceived to be, incapable of working, right? And therefore, they are deemed eligible for assistance. Now, we've seen shifts in that, and you see now they're trying to, enforce work requirements against SNAP recipients, even though, in fact, many of them would have difficulty obtaining employment that would provide an adequate income. Of course, you also need to consider in this context, when you're talking about the residual or limited nature of social welfare in the United States, its connection to the labor system. Okay? You cannot understand social welfare without understanding the labor and really more broadly economic system that is currently dominant in the United States. And I will forthrightly note that I am a critic of that system. I consider myself an anti-capitalist, and so that's the perspective that I come from. The system produces inequality. It produces economic need. It produces a sharp distinction between those who have a great deal of resources and those who have very little. And social welfare programs exist to some extent to remediate that. The question is how much do they remediate it? All right. And so, we had in this country in the middle 20th century a movement away from that English poor law tradition with the New Deal and the Great Society, where there was an effort, at least for some, not for all, right? Of course, we have to remember the influence of white supremacy in the structure of those programs as well. And I think that's particularly important to understand. They were not perfect, but they were better than what we have now in terms of their coverage, even though many of those programs were still highly residual public assistance programs. Franklin Roosevelt, however, if you are familiar with this, gave a speech in 1944 that is known as the Economic Bill of Rights speech. And you asked about passions, touch tones, things that sort of animate the work that I do. That speech, the Economic Bill of Rights, is a cornerstone of the work that I do. The idea that people should have a right to a job at decent wages, the right to health care, the right to education. We can talk about that more if you'd like, right? The right to security in instances of being over a certain age or having a disability or what have you, right? In short, I would say the right to live, right? And this is what social movements, the social movements for economic justice have articulated, that human beings, by virtue of being alive, should be understood to have a right to live, a right to thrive. And this is also why, and if I may hone in on that first of Roosevelt's Economic Bill of Rights, the right to a job, I work with an organization called the National Jobs for All Network. And this group, which has existed for 30 years, advocates a human right to employment, good jobs at good wages. And to me, that is the cornerstone of building this kind of economic security society that I have spent my life working to achieve, and want to continue doing that as long as I draw breath, right? This is why I will never retire from my faculty work, with all due respect to those of you who decide to do so, because, I want to keep doing this as long as I can draw breath. And I understand, of course, you can continue doing that when you retire, and I'm not casting aspersions in that regard in any way. But that having been said, right, we're all in this struggle together, and it's a struggle for economic justice. And it is this kind of vision that animates all of the work that I do. And to me, by the way, those are the values of social work properly understood. When we talk about in Section 6 of our Code of Ethics, that social workers have an obligation to ensure that all people, not just a few, all people have adequate resources, right? This is what it's about. And the Economic Bill of Rights is a mechanism to achieve that in the context of what, as Dr. David Gill would suggest, is a structurally unjust society. And I think that's it's important that we want to think about long-term transformations where workers really have democratic control over their workplaces and this kind of thing. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the work of the economist Richard Wolff. I think he has some wonderful ideas about democracy at work that we can build on in trying to move in that direction. I know I've gone in a lot of directions, but if you have follow-up, I'm ready, willing, and able.
Well, these values are rooted in the founding documents of this nation. So we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So it's in our documents. It's part of our code, our DNA. And I've often wondered why, but this pursuit of happiness, we don't seem to connect to the economics. We think Scott Fitzgerald, the author, said that poverty is not a crime. He wanted to remind us that. And often in America, we have people who treat poverty as if it's a crime over there. So it is that this pursuit of happiness, that's what we're really talking about. And probably a government that helps us with that. We should be supportive, and that's what social safety nets are about. So I myself, as a child, was homeless. My mother and our father had left us, and we ended up on the streets, and we were homeless. And I remember that time, and that was not my mother's fault. That wasn't my fault. This in true valiance days in the English codes, we put the blame on us. And stuff like that. And their solution would be to take the child away from the mother. over there. That's what their solution in those days would have been, and put them both in workhouses in that sense. But this idea, we're really talking about a pursuit of happiness. I'm wondering, because it's the same in education. I look at education. It's definitely a landscape that's changed. A lot of the policies and standards seem to get in the way of being a good teacher. So a good teacher for me was my sixth grade teacher, Mr. Bass, who, when I was homeless, and you had to bring your lunch to school or go home for lunch because there was no lunch programs in those days. I'm 71, so we didn't have one. And so Mr. Bass noticed I had no lunch. And he used to bring in, he knew I liked liverwurst, and he would bring in 2 liverwurst sandwiches and say, "Help me, Jesse, help me. What am I going to do? I can't eat 2 of these. I don't even like it. What am I supposed to do? Would you like one?" And so he fed me for a year. And I'm wondering, we're so focused on test scores, so focused on product education, that we're forgetting the humanity of what makes a good teacher. And the burnout in teaching, to me, is probably similar. I'm not certain if there's a burnout in social work, but in teaching, we have a burnout because we have so many policies that interfere with that humanity of being a good teacher stuff. But is that true for social work? Is there a burnout?
Well, just very briefly in reference to that, I'm just back from the national conference of our professional association, the National Association of Social Workers. And while I didn't attend these sessions, it was reported that the sessions on burnout were, this is a conference of largely social work practitioners. Some academics attend as well, but the sessions on burnout were apparently the most widely attended sessions at this conference. And of course that speaks to it. And it's not, it was nothing that I didn't know. To put this in context, I think this is where understanding policy and understanding historical trends in policy are extremely important. So as you well know, 45 years ago, there was a profound shift away from that New Deal Great Society consensus of some supports for economic security, some easing of the burdens that workers face in this corporate system of economic exploitation. And what began to happen is those who owned and controlled the corporations mobilized against the gains, particularly, and this is, I think, important on Juneteenth, particularly the gains made by people of color in the civil rights era of the 1960s. As the benefits of that social welfare system began to be extended more broadly, a counterattack was mobilized, right? And those who own and control the economic system effectively utilized racial resentment and mobilized white supremacist rhetoric to destroy the minimal guarantees that had been won in the years between 1930 and 1980. And there's no more important figure in this regard than that reprehensible individual named Ronald Wilson Reagan, okay, who I think is frankly the root cause, if you would identify one individual of this period that we are living in now. So Reagan and the mobilization, really, you can't reduce this, of course, to one person. It was a social movement of oligarchs and the wealthy elements of our societies and other societies to undo what scholars have called the social compact between capital and labor in the middle years of the 20th century, right? So very briefly, all of the gains made, and Reagan, by the way, used the trope of the so-called welfare queen to mobilize racial resentment, to get workers to vote against their own economic interests. He was elected, and so one of the first things he did, as I'm sure you're aware, is to fire the PATCO workers and was striking. And this, of course, sent a message to the corporate sector that it was a war on workers. A war on workers could be unleashed, and it was, right? And as we know, unions were decimated. The union density rate has steadily declined. And by the way, if I were able to show charts and so forth, you could trace the decline in the union density rate refers to the population of the workforce, the percentage of the workforce that's unionized, right? So you could trace the decline in union density with the rise in economic inequality that has been the story of the last 45 years. Okay, so you ask then, why are teachers then facing this situation of constant burnout, and why also in the social welfare sector is it the same? Well, of course, if you drastically cut the workforce, which they had done in the 1980s as well as in the current period, right? You're going to see an increase in pressure on the workers that remain to do more work. We call this in the labor movement a speed up, right? Where they're trying to extract more labor out of workers in the workforce. And so this anti-union mobilization, the cuts in social welfare, by the way, the intentional redistribution of wealth and income to those who already had too much through repeated tax cuts to the very wealthy, beginning under Reagan, continuing under George W. Bush in the early part of this century, and of course under this current regime where they've doubled down on this so-called trickle-down economic policy, which of course, as everyone who studies economics understands, it doesn't trickle, right? Perhaps something else is trickling. I don't know. But in any event, this is a policy shift that those of us who analyze this kind of stuff refer to as a trend towards neoliberalism. Now, that is important to unpack a little bit for people who may not be familiar with it. It has nothing to do with what people call liberal in a political context, political liberalism, right? Which tends to imply progressive or quasi-progressive kind of policies, right, of economic justice and so on. Liberalism, understood in an economic context, refers to what some analysts call market fundamentalism, extreme marketization. So, there has been, with all the cuts in the public sector over the last 45 years, then, consistent with neoliberal thinking, and you can find the source of neoliberalism in the writings of economists like Friedrich Hayek, Ludwig von Mises. There's a whole bunch. Oh, and of course, the very well-known University of Chicago economist Milton Friedman. Anyway, so that trend towards neoliberalism, which disinvests in the public sector, privatizes, cuts workforces, right? Makes employment more economically insecure. You see that with the rise of Uber and the so-called gig economy and all of this kind of thing, right? You then see a great increase in inequality and a great increase in economic insecurity, greater pressures in people who are actually employed, who are making proportionately less, don't have the pensions that their ancestors had, don't have some of the other supports that are available, such as the supports for education. So there's, the short answer, and of course I rarely, as I tell my students in class, I rarely give short answers to any question. The short answer is that this trend away from a consensus on what some refer to as Keynesian economics, where there's a public sector, there's an investment in public goods to invest in the broad population, to redistribute wealth and income to some degree and so on. The trend away from that economic consensus to this neoliberal, brutal market economic policy, privatization. In the education era, charter schools are a symptom of that, for example, right? And I'm sure you could tell me all kinds of things about those that I don't know. But it's all connected, right? And the disinvestment in public higher education. You and I have both testified in front of our legislature on this very issue. You know, when I attended Southern Connecticut State University, even in the 1980s, at the beginning of the neoliberal era, my wife and I paid $500 a semester to attend Southern. Her mother went in the 1950s and paid $50, right? Look at what's happened. My students are paying, 100 times or more than what my mother-in-law paid, and they're paying, many multiples of what we paid. In any event, it's those math. That math may not be correct. I'm not a math professor,
Okay.
but anyway, all right.
It's a lot more.
I've gone way far afield. Yes, it's a lot more. It's exponentially greater what my students are forced to pay, and they therefore have to take out loans. It's just a horrendous system. There's a better way. All right, I'm done.
Yeah. No, that makes perfect sense. A friend of mine, the first black mayor of Jersey City, New Jersey, who sadly passed away, but Glenn Cunningham, who used to be a police officer. He used to always come to our young student political organizations to give talks. And he used to talk about that poverty is a moneymaker. And you have to look at the industries that make money off the poor. So we might look at landlords who don't repair their properties, who overcharge for their properties, who are almost inhuman to their tenants over there. We have to look. They're making money off this stuff, and they don't want a lot of regulation. They don't want oversight over there. They don't want the city of New Haven to come down and say, hey, why isn't the heat on in this building? We're going to fine you. We're going to close you down. They don't want any of that. So this kind of stuff, that there are industries that profit off the misery of the poor, is about as unchristian as you can get. And of course, in America, one of the things that white supremacists recognize is a lot of the focus of those would be on people of color. And it isn't to say that there's more white people on welfare, need SNAP benefits, than there are people of color. It isn't that piece, but the racism over there, they don't see that. My grandfather used to say, racists don't look at their own pocketbook. They don't look at their own faith. They don't look at themselves over there. But we have these industries that are profiting off the poor. For-profit prisons, charter schools, just like you said, and there's no greater corruption in public education than charter schools. Literally, they close down before 2 years, 3 years, and nobody knows where the money goes and stuff like that. And there's literally so many people have written and documented billions and billions of dollars in fraud. And the same thing for profit prisons that will pop up, and those are the ones where everybody, somehow the bad guys escape because there's nobody watching the gate over there. But yeah, it's part of that stuff. So Stephen, I titled this show, social work is the new activism today. So in the past, a social worker, I mean, it's just like teachers. I didn't have to fight the system. Maybe I did, but it was a policy piece trying to make them aware you could do this to make better changes and stuff like that. But now I'm feeling like that social workers and teachers as well have to be like activists. Isn't like you and I have been arrested together. I mean, we've been at civil disobedience actions in Hartford for healthcare for all over there. This kind of stuff. And I don't know professors 20 years ago, our professors, your professor, that wasn't going to happen with them. They may have been at peace protests during the Vietnam War, maybe, but they certainly weren't at protests complaining about policies that are unfair or bad health care. They just weren't doing that. So is the new social worker also not only an advocate, but do they have to consider themselves an activist as well? Is this a new component, a new social work?
Well, I wouldn't say that it's new, right? But I think there is as you suggest, an increased imperative for individuals in the social work field and in other fields, as you suggest, such as teaching and many other professional fields.
Healthcare.
Doctors, really nurses. We are, I think, anyone who is involved in something to do with the public good is under attack right now. And therefore, the kind of perspective that I try to impart to my students, certainly, is one in which it is absolutely necessary for them to become involved to the extent that they are able. I think it's really important in this context to understand positionality and what people can do in terms of activism. Not everyone necessarily will be able to take a rest at the Capitol without significant repercussions, and people need to be fully aware of those risks given their particular positionalities in terms of taking that action. But that said, for those who are faculty members and the university professorship is one of the more secure occupations in this unfortunately unsecure occupational system, and therefore, in my view, it imposes upon those of us who have such privilege an obligation to engage in that kind of work. Now, I understand that in a diverse society, not everyone will necessarily see things the way I do in that regard, but I hope certainly that more of my colleagues understand the need to engage in some of this work, and I think we have seen some of that, right? With some of the attacks on faculty unionization in the public sector, with the Janus decision, Supreme Court decision, for example, which made dues paying in public sector work optional. So therefore, there's just an increasing imperative across all fields, whether you're talking about university teaching, whether you're talking about nursing, whether you're talking about teaching, whether you're talking about social work. There's an increasing imperative for all of us to engage in movement building and power expansion strategies. Okay? That is to say, as the noted community organizer Saul Alinsky said, that what we have is people power. They have all the money, right? The oligarchs, Bezos, Musk, etc., right? We have people. And the key, in my view, is to raise the consciousness of enough of that population. And research in political science shows if you mobilize somewhere on the neighborhood of 5 to 10%, I've read different studies in that regard of the population, you can have a revolution if you want. Right now, it's a challenge to get that far, I think, at this point. But if we can just, first of all, let's be really clear: resist, reduce, remediate the current fascist threat. And I'm going to use the F word. I'll use other F words, not when we're off the air. But, I'm going to use that word and say that we need to, number one, resist that. And then we need to think about what we do after this horrible period, right? To remediate, to build a better society, to move the ball forward, right? And what does that entail? It entails some of the agenda that I talked about earlier with the Economic Bill of Rights and so on, right? But it all, in terms of how we do all of that, right? And it's easy for me to sit here and talk about it, but I think, this is one reason why I get myself involved in these things, so that I can help in whatever way that I can to create this world, right? But we need to build the power, right? We need to build the power. Power is, we heard this at our recent social work conference. Social workers sometimes recoil at the idea of building power, and perhaps it's true of teachers too. We need to embrace power. Power is how we will win and how we will achieve the goals that we want to achieve, right? And to resist in the short term this horrendous regime that's in control of our government, a regime that's animated by virulent white supremacy, patriarchy, oligarchy, and all of the things that decent people everywhere should oppose, right? I think we have to be 100% explicit about that too, okay? And I am in my classes. So this having been said, right? It begins with critical consciousness. And indeed, that's what I see myself doing in the classroom, right? I am engaging in resistance in that classroom by teaching from a critical perspective to undermine this unjust social, political, and economic order. And I make that very explicit to my students. I'm not, in there, trying to say, I'm adopting some, academic, objective stance or what have you. What a bunch of, I might use a pejorative there if I said it. That's a bunch of horse manure, if I may clean it up a little bit, okay? And in any event, right, in any kind of human phenomenon, and social work is inevitably engaged in human society. It's social, right? Okay? Right? You cannot be, quote unquote, objective. That's a bunch of malarkey, all right? We're a value-based profession, and we're either going to stand, right, with the oppressed, with those we work with, and stand for social and economic justice, or we're going to be servants of the power structure and agents of oppression. And social work has been that in some respects, by the way. That's not the kind of social work I do. That's not the kind of life that I lead. I'm against all of that kind of garbage. All right. I'm done with that.
We have this feeling that or not feeling, but this push from power that doesn't approve of anything to lift the lives of the poor and needy. And that's been around for a long time. So we document that. The English codes, and it goes back millions of years. I'm sure we could go back to the Pharaoh and find, stuff in Egypt the same way. So we blame the poor for being poor. And I think we'd look to this new Pope Leo, defense of the poor, because he would say there is no neutrality, no objectivity of the poor. You either are for them or you're against them. Mm-hmm. And some of the stuff that I try to help people understand is, especially like blue collar workers and stuff. When you lift the poor, you lift yourself. This is the way it is. We know, we study, we can look back economically, and the times we have done more for working people, help people with housing, help people get when we had real pensions, and we were all better off in that sense. So lifting our bottom lifts everyone. It lifts every boat in society. And, so it's that piece. So when you're working, when your students, do they resist that idea that, well, maybe there are policies that are harmful and we should be quiet? Do they resist? Do they want to be silent? Because for me, silence is the greatest oppressor.
Silence is complicity, as we often say in social movements, right? Of course, there's some of that, right? I mean, there are people who enter into these fields who just want to sort of put their head down and, do whatever the system suggests that they quote unquote should do. And so, you may not reach all of those individuals, right? And I recognize this, but I understand from my analysis that I don't have to reach all of those individuals, right? I may not like the fact that some of them, from my perspective, quote unquote, don't get it, aren't getting involved, are passive, are complicit by virtue of not engaging in the work. And there may be some also, and I also recognize this, who feel that they can't because, as I said before, because of positionality. And I have great respect for that. I understand individuals who may not have the courage or the maybe that's the wrong word, may not feel that they can overcome the threats that they face in their lives to engage in this work. But that said, I don't need them all, right? Remember, what did I say? 10%, right? And again, that's a figure. I don't have the study in front of me, etc. 5 to 10%, something like this, right? That you mobilize of a population. So I don't need to necessarily raise consciousness of the entire working class. I don't think that's ever been done. Okay, but if we and we serve working class students, as you know, at CSU, right? But if I'm able to raise the consciousness of enough of them, I'm meeting with a student later today on some of this, right? And I do stuff like that, right? The students who express an interest in this, I'll engage with them after they graduate and say, come on into the movement work and so on. And there's usually a few of these every semester, right? And some of them have over time become valued colleagues in the struggle to achieve this. The work I do with National Jobs for All, for example, is heavily supported by a former student of mine who's our chief organizer here in Connecticut. And so, I think that I understand that what I do is going to come across to some people. It's going to motivate some of them to become engaged, others for either particular aspects of their own situation or their own desire to not be quote unquote political, even though all social work is political, by the way, to one degree or another, as all teaching is, by the way. In my view, right, these things are inherently political. But that having been said, we want to mobilize as many people as we can, and get them engaged in some aspect of the work and provide ways in which people can plug in to local, state, and national activism. And this, we're sort of coming to the end of the program. I do want to be clear, that there are important organizing strategies and approaches that individuals in social work and related human service fields can get engaged in order to do this work. For those who may have a interest in what I call radical social work, that is social work that is getting at the root cause of social problems, I want to call attention to something called the Social Welfare Action Alliance. And I will try to put the link in the chat if I can get it. The Social Welfare Action Alliance, which is a group of radical social workers that exists at the national level. People can join that. We have a Connecticut chapter, and I would encourage people to become involved in that if they are in the social work field and want to engage in this kind of social change work. There also are, I've mentioned, of course, the National Jobs for All Network, which I'm also involved in. I would like to call attention, I think, and you're certainly familiar with some Connecticut-based groups like Connecticut for All, which is a coalition in this state that is fighting for economic and social justice. And Connecticut for All, I think, is something, these kinds of that's a power building strategy, bringing together existing organizations in a coalition, which is basically a group of groups, right? And our own faculty union, AUP, is involved in this. And so I think that there are ways in which people can get involved. I also want to say something, even though I am a self-professed radical social worker trying to get at the root causes of social problems, transform this unjust system into one that is actually just and provides economic security and well-being for all. I also recognize, that's not going to happen tomorrow, right? So what do we need to do in the short term, right? Of course, we need to resist the fascist incursion by any means necessary. I think, including if you feel yourself able to do this, civil disobedience, right? But also getting involved in the legislative process. As part of the program of the teaching that I do at Southern, I run a lobby day program, help organize this with a group of academics statewide and all the social work programs across the state, and our local chapter of the National Association of Social Workers, to bring social work students to the Capitol to engage in lobbying, engaging in working on bills. We teach a course in this, right? Now, obviously, that's not radical change, right? It's incremental change. Schwab certainly tries to bring a radical perspective into this, that after you do this incremental change, how about looking at, more long-term solutions, like maybe Connecticut single payer system or something like this, right, in healthcare. In any event, all of that having been said, right, you have to pursue incremental change in the short term to limit damage and to move the ball forward as you can, right? While, as the civil rights movement correctly said, keeping the eyes on the prize. What is the long-term goal of labor and social movements? And that long-term goal has to be workplace democracy and guaranteed employment for all at decent wages, right? That's the bedrock minimum in my view. Okay. All right,
so we've got small steps lead to big change over there. Labor and coalitions with labor and community groups are important, and activism over there, and jobs and wages. I mean, it's funny, in Northern Ireland for years they called it the Troubles, and there was violence all over. And then Bill Clinton came along, sent Senator Mitchell over and said, I'm going to give you $11 billion. And all of a sudden everybody had a job. And once everybody had a good job, paid everything, nobody had any time to blow anything up anymore and stuff. It's not that the situation in the North is completely quiet now, but it's better off than what was going on. So, Stephen, we really are down to like the last 2 minutes. So I think what could help us is, I want to know how people interested in social work could find their way to your program at Southern Connecticut State University. Because as far as I'm concerned, you're the only one in our CSU system that has a doctorate for social work. Can you tell us about that? Help us get some students, Stephen.
Oh, absolutely. Well, I would absolutely love to have some students potentially engage in obtaining a master's degree at our program. We also have a doctoral program, and of course, and an undergraduate program as well. And in our master's program, we have what we call our community practice concentration, which is focused on this kind of work. All social workers take the kind of historical social welfare policy course that I teach and alluded to earlier. But some students will specialize in what we call community or macro practice, and they can certainly find out about that by contacting us at our website. And I'm trying to find the link as I talk.
Oh, don't worry.
here.
We'll put the web.
Yep.
We'll hook that up. And
Okay.
we're approaching our last.
Okay, but very briefly, our community practice program is the program that trains people in doing this kind of work. We have a program like that at Southern,
Right.
and please do contact me or one of my colleagues in that program so that we can have you enroll. Thank you.
And Southern Connecticut State University is that other great university in Connecticut, and it is a leader in social work, among other things too. Thank
Absolutely.
you, Stephen, for being a guest. Need to have you back again because looks like we're just starting the small steps, and we might need a revolution. I don't know. I might need you. I hope
Well,
I
I'm
don't have
happy
get
to
arrested
talk
with
about
you
it.
again. All right.
I'm
All
happy
right.
to talk about it.
No problem. Thank you. Thank you. New Haven, thank you. Happy Juneteenth Day. Please go attend some Juneteenth events, especially around New Haven. The committee has many events there. And you can go on the green to see the flag that was raised on Monday. And happy Juneteenth. And let's just look to a better world. Thank you. Thank you.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there, telling me I got to beware. I think it's time we stop, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.